So my name's Jessica Hayes. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist and I specialise in OCD and perinatal mental health. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I work with OCD to then show you a little bit about why certain times you're more likely to experience OCD and why certain populations find it that they get OCD and kind of start to struggle with that. So I like to use this image to explain a little bit about OCD, and I take quite a long-term approach of understanding OCD. So we look at kind of how OCD works in the current moment. So that's kind of having some sort of internal or external trigger, and then you get intrusive thoughts, images or impulses. That leads to an interpretation of that thought, which leads to an emotional response, which leads to a behaviour. And then the cycle at the bottom is that your intrusive thoughts cause an emotional reaction and then you respond and it loops round and you start to struggle with the OCD. But on top of that, you've got the impact of your general emotional well-being and stress levels, which kind of factor into how intense the emotion you get with your intrusive thoughts, which makes them feel more believable and more scary. And then on the other side, you've got all your background beliefs and the ways that you think about things and your personality style and your early life experiences, which lead to kind of getting different types of intrusive thoughts, but equally mean that you latch on to different things and you find different things important and different things scary. So one of the ways that we understand OCD is that in general, you've got quite a different pattern of thinking in general, and then after that, something can trigger you off and your OCD will start to latch onto something, and then you'll get this kind of day-to-day spiral. So when we're looking at how to work with OCD, what we do is we figure out what your system looks like. So what has happened to you in the past that might impact on it, what personality types and general thinking styles you've got, how it happens in the moment. So when you get intrusive thoughts, how you respond to them, what your brain tells you is so important about them. But we also look at your general day-to-day coping strategies and how well you tolerate stress and how much capacity you've got for extra anxiety to kind of sit with the anxious thoughts. So this is the reason why certain people find that kind of different stages in their life they're more likely to have OCD kick in. So things like big changes like going to university, getting your own home where you're suddenly responsible for things for the first time and it's up to you to make sure that door's locked rather than you can give that responsibility to someone else. When you're a new parent's a big trigger because you've got hormones going, you've got loads of life stress, and your capacity to do all the things that you previously did to look after yourself gets impacted quite a lot. We always need to start off by making sure your general coping skills are pretty good and you are looking after yourself in really basic ways. And it might sound really simple, but a lot of people forget to do that. A lot of people forget to manage general stress when their anxiety is really high. They forget to feed themselves regularly. They forget to treat themselves like a decent person who deserves baths regularly or deserves to have nice hobbies and things like that. And because you're treating yourself like a bad person and because you are not looking after your needs, you're then going to get higher emotional responses and less capacity to challenge the things that you do that make the OCD worse. And this is why it becomes a really horrible self-fulfilling prophecy of treating yourself like a bad person so you feel like a bad person. Something that happens as well is that if you believe that thoughts are important and meaningful and you put a lot of emphasis on kind of listening to thoughts always, then of course if you get intrusive scary thoughts you're going to find it really hard not to believe them. So one of the things that I work on is even from as early as possible, talk to your children about what intrusive thoughts are. Talk to them about how not all thoughts are meaningful and that you can get scary thoughts, and then scary thoughts are not going to be nice, but they're going to be able to sit there and you don't have to do anything with them. I actually wrote a children's book with my 6-year-old to discuss that, to talk about how, if you feed into them, if you're listening to them, if you're doing what they say, they're going to get louder and they're going to get more scary. But if you learn to create almost like a visual shield and externalize them over there, then you can carry on with your life and they'll get smaller and they'll get less loud. And that'll be easier to work with. If you equip your children early on to do that, it means that they're probably not going to fall into these patterns when they're older, where the OCD just believes thoughts and runs with them. One of the other things we need to do is talk a lot about intrusive thoughts in pregnancy and postnatally, because people are really likely to get more intrusive thoughts during these times because of natural worries that your OCD can latch onto and hormone shifts and less capacity to deal with things. If we know what the thoughts are and we can predict these things might happen, and you work on building resilience and building resources of coping before baby even gets here, then you're going to have a lot less people who are too scared to ask for help because the thoughts are too scary and they're worried about being judged for them. And you're going to get less people struggling with these types of thoughts. One of the things to keep in mind as well is neurodivergence overlaps a lot with OCD. Things like hyperfixations. Your OCD, if you naturally hyperfixate on things, then of course it makes sense that you get obsessional over an intrusive thought that comes in. So it's important to not try and shut off the hyperfixations, but actually work with them and give yourself something positive to fixate on and to let your brain run wild with when it needs to, and start to recognize that need and nurture it rather than trying to shut it off, because then that need will be fulfilled. It's like exercise for your brain. If you've exercised your brain well, it means that you're less likely to get really worked up and your brain wants something to latch onto and then just grabs the next intrusive thought it gets to focus on. Sensory input as well. Like, we underestimate how much as a human we need to regulate ourselves through our senses. And it's not just a neurodivergent thing, you know. Everyone goes through things where they are feeling really overwhelmed and they like certain textures, or they like hugs, or they like kind of to be in close contact with things, or they've got like excess energy and they could do with fidgeting with things, or they could do with bouncing. If you listen to those needs more, especially if you're neurodivergent, but in general as a human, you're probably going to regulate yourself a lot better, so you're going to be more resilient when it comes to not feeding into the OCD. Because if you look at that cycle, your emotional response goes up and then you respond as a way to either get rid of that feeling or to try and stop that scary thing from happening. If you have the ability to tolerate a little bit extra stress than you're already feeling, then you're going to be more likely to not feed into the OCD. Whereas if you just don't have the capacity to increase your stress levels because you're so dysregulated anyway, it's really, really difficult to break that cycle, even in therapy, right? So one of the things I do with a lot of my clients is start off by doing all these regulation things, checking out what kind of things they do in day-to-day life to look after themselves. But I also make sure I explain it to people. So you'll always see these kind of diagrams with me. You'll always see why I'm recommending these things, because I know how so many people have bad experiences of reaching out for mental health support and being told, well, just take a bath or go for a walk or go for a run. And it makes people feel that that's quite dismissive and it's invalidating, whereas actually, if you understand, well, no, we're doing this so we can then give you the capacity to challenge the OCD, well, then they're more likely to do it. One thing I find, especially with new parents, is that they're starting from scratch with this stuff anyway, because all the things you used to do to look after yourself and to be functioning in general life gets thrown out the window in the baby bubble, and then we forget how to then bring it back into life. And also, we can't, go for runs every day most of the time when we've had a baby, because we just can't physically leave the house. So having to sit with someone and problem solve, well, what can we put in place that gets that need met for you? Sometimes that in itself, that chunk of therapy where we sit there and we go, right, well, it's not practical for you to go for a bath every time you're feeling stressed because you have to wait for the baby to go down. So how about we think about 5-minute things that you can do to regulate yourself? How about we put a podcast in one ear while you're carrying around a screaming child, so you get at least some level of regulation or time for yourself? Or how about when you go for a walk, you walk to a friend's house and they walk along with you with the baby? Like, coming up with ways to look after yourself now to mean that you've got more capacity to challenge the OCD. I think so many people challenge the OCD and then they can't keep going because they don't have capacity to do so, and then they think they failed at therapy, when actually you probably just need to take a few steps back and figure out why that's not working for you. One thing I also do is, like mentioned, the longer term factors. So things like taking lots of responsibility over things, or not being able to tolerate any level of uncertainty. If you don't do some of this work first, it's very, very difficult to then do it related to something really scary. One thing I talk about a lot is, if you can't sit through an entire TV show whilst knowing you know someone from somewhere but not going on IMDb to figure out who that person is before the end of the show, if you can't do that and you can't wait and do that after the show, then the idea of you tolerating the uncertainty about whether you've just killed someone with your car is absolutely ridiculous, isn't it? Like, if you can't tolerate that tiny bit, why expect yourself to jump to something really, really scary? Making sure that you're doing this background work, even though it might feel frustrating because you're not directly challenging the OCD right then and there, it's going to set you up to actually be able to challenge it better in the long run anyway, because you're going to have the skills and you're going to have done all the background work. That means that the exposure work's then going to be a lot easier for you. It's not going to feel as scary, it's not going to feel as abnormal, and you're probably going to be able to do it more consistently because you already know what you're doing. So sometimes I get people to do things like not go on IMDb until the end, or purposely recognise that feeling that their brain needs something to focus on and go and use that purposely for something they need to do or want to do or are interested in. Or sometimes we practice skills like from ACT therapy, where it's kind of dropping anchor and acknowledging that a thought's there, even not an intrusive thought, just a normal thought, acknowledging it, labeling it, reconnecting with your body, and then re-engaging with whatever it is you're doing. If you can do that in positive thoughts and neutral thoughts, then you're going to find it a lot easier to do that when it comes to scary thoughts, right? So it's about doing things in a graded way where you do a step at a time and constantly make little bits of progress rather than expecting yourself to do big jumps. I guess that's the privilege of doing private therapy as well, because we can afford to take time and go around the OCD as well as working with the OCD. And with the perinatal work, it tends to be so much that's changed. We need to do quite a lot of work on building up your identity and your sense of self, and challenging any negative judgments you've got about yourself and your parenting abilities, and being able to reconnect with people, because ultimately maybe you've outgrown some friendships, or you've drifted apart, or not prioritized your relationship because you've just been surviving. Like, sometimes you have to do some of that work first before you can challenge the OCD anyway. And that doesn't mean you're not working on the OCD, it just means that you need more of a graded approach. And we're aiming for the OCD to be managed and be understood long term, rather than just let's play whack-a-mole and get rid of this tiny version of it, but it'll probably pop up in another year's time over something random, and I won't have the ability to know what to do. I don't know if you've heard of it before, but in CBT we talk about helping someone become their own therapist. And that doesn't mean you might not need therapy again. It just means that you at least understand all the reasoning behind what we've done, and you really understand your own mind and your own way of working. So in the future, if you start to struggle with things, you're probably more capable of managing it yourself. And if you need a little bit of a check-in and a bit of guidance, it's probably not going to be another full massive bout of therapy. Sometimes we get people to look too into their own role in their mental health. So talk about like what they do with thoughts, their behaviours and things, and we forget that actually society and the way it's set up is also really hard on our mental health. So even if you do have to come back to therapy for things that stress has triggered, that doesn't necessarily mean you've not done it right the first time. It just means that we live in a very stressful world that's not set up to help us regulate ourselves and look after ourselves. So we sometimes have to have extra therapy to manage that, and that's not a bad thing. So if you are having a difficult time with OCD, which you might be, because you can have lots of times in your life where you might struggle with OCD, if you can, reach out for some help as early as possible, because the earlier you equip yourself with all these things and all this knowledge around how your OCD works and how your brain and your body work, the more you're going to be able to tackle things in the future. You can reach out to your GP, you can reach out to midwives and health visitors if it's kind of perinatal OCD. You can reach out to universities and colleges, but make sure that if it's OCD specific help you want, you reach out to people for OCD who are experienced in working with it. So you can go on OCD UK for more advice about how to find people. You can find information on my website and my Instagram pages if you need some specific advice and support. If you think this approach would work for you, like if you like the idea of not just focusing on the ERP stuff but working around it, you can ask cognitive behavioural therapists, as long as they are also trained in OCD, can work this way, because that's the cognitive part of the cognitive behavioural therapy. The ERP is the behavioural part. So ask them how they work with it and check if they work on resilience building and things like that. And you can do shorter courses as well of just meeting up with other mums and figuring out how to build resilience. The important part is to ask for help, because I think research from OCD UK said it takes on average people 25 years to start trying to access support. So try not to be one of those figures. But if you are, you can go from struggling with OCD for decades and being really isolated alone in your home to actually getting to the point where you can re-engage with your life again. So it isn't too late. Obviously, the earlier the support, the better, but more from your point of view, so you actually get to live your life in the way you want to. There's not a deadline on how ingrained the OCD has to be before help will help it.